Today is June 7, 2016, and in the scriptural calendar, it is the new moon of the third month. So, before we get into things, let us ask our Heavenly Family to bless us. Heavenly Family, thank you so very much for bringing us to yet another new moon. And thank you for not failing to bring forth for us fresh fruit from the tree of life. Though we do not yet understand the implications of what you will be showing to us, we know that it is vastly important, and we want to understand it, and we want our minds to be totally revolutionized in order to think according to truth and only according to truth. So please help us to understand the subject. Heavenly Family, I want to ask that you put it upon each person here to really investigate these things according to reason and right thinking, and also to be able to relate what we're going to be going through to their own lives. All the lessons of this, both in terms of the content of the subject that we're going to be looking at, but also the lessons from the way of thinking necessary to operate within in order to understand it. So please bless us all. Help us to really experience your leading, and not to view any of this in merely theoretical terms, but to gain a grasp of what reality is like and what it means to operate in harmony with it. So thank you so much. Please guide us. Send your angels to each individual here. Help us all to have the right attitude and character in our investigations. Todah, we ask these things, B'Shem Tzemach, who were he, in the name of the branch, he and she. Amen. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are many aspects to what we're going to be going through today. There's a lot of subject matter to cover, so we need to dive right into it. I just want to say how I know that when going through a lot of material at one time, basically it's just presenting the thing before you all, and then you guys can examine it, pray about it, investigate it, and so on. And I know that sometimes it's easy when covering a lot of material at one time to only think of it as a theory. But I know that it's very important to think about it a lot more than that. So because of the amount of material, we will have to go through it very quickly. So please get a notebook or be at your computer or something and just take notes of references, if it's just that even, and then you can go back over. And of course, this is being recorded, and you can go through it at some point later. The other element that I want to mention is that the subject matter of today's study is best understood, and perhaps only rightly understood, in the light of things that we have already gone through in this message. Our Heavenly Family has been preparing us for things one thing at a time. And the acceptance of one truth paves the way for the acceptance of another. And so there's a number of elements that we've talked about recently that are important to keep in mind, and I'll reference some of the particular aspects as we go. But most importantly, the principles of the foundation of truth. Our Heavenly Family has really lately been removing our supposed foundations, not the foundations of the 30 Angels message or anything like that, not the foundations of the truth or the messages that we've received, but we have, even things, of course, like the existence of God. Well, our prior conceptions until about a month ago, until exactly a month ago, our prior conceptions of the basis for belief in God have been wrong. We have not actually had a true foundation. And the foundation that we had for our belief in God was actually false. So our Heavenly Family had to take down that foundation in order that they may give us the right foundation, which they did, and it was a wonderful thing. So that's one of the things that is potentially part of our subject today. That is, it's part of taking down certain foundations or perceived foundations and establishing stronger foundations. That said, it's not entirely to take down certain foundations. It's more that we have misunderstood certain things, and our Heavenly Family has clarification for us, and they have a lot more information. And so that it'll change our perspective. Again, like I said, I don't know all of the implications of the new aspects that they are showing us. Where it all leads, what the conclusions are, what is impacted by it is yet to be seen. And I'm sure that our Heavenly Family will show us, and by our earnest investigation, we will end up seeing kind of what stems from this. And there's kind of one primary subject, but it has some other things that will end up kind of touching on it and expanding on things, and it relates to things that we've talked about recently. So the primary subject is what some people call cosmogony. So there's the word cosmology. Ology, like you have theology, Christology, biology, all these different ologies. And it's the study of something or the understanding of something. So cosmology is the study of the cosmos or the understanding of the cosmos. Cosmos is the world or the universe. Cosmogony is the origin of the cosmos. So ogeny, like progeny, and different words like that, it's talking about the origin of something. So cosmogony, and it's scriptural cosmology. That's what we're going to be looking at. And this has a number of different aspects to it. So we are all familiar with Genesis 1 and 2, and that's where we look in the Bible to find the account of creation, the account of the origin of the world. That's where we're accustomed to looking, and for most Bible believers, that's all we are aware of. The fact of the matter, though, is that there are actually a number of other creation accounts in the Bible. And we're going to be talking about those and Genesis 1 and 2 and seeing a broader picture of scriptural cosmogony, which is the origin of the world. So we're going to be looking at this and considering it, but first I want to address why it is that Genesis 1 and 2 are the most commonly known creation accounts from the Bible, and why that has led to impartial views. Well, we'll see why it's led to impartial views as we go, or to, more specifically, to partial views. So this is all actually part of deconstructing our worldview of canon theology. You know, we have all grown up, if we grew up Christian, we've grown up with this view of the Bible as a book, and it's set as it is, and we haven't known how it came to be like that. We haven't known if there's anything else besides that. Okay, I'll just repeat that because there's a couple beeps. We're used to the idea of the Bible as it is, especially in North America, where there's a heavy Protestant presence. We're used to the 66 books of the Protestant Bible. Sure, there are many Catholics as well, in which case they're also used to the Apocrypha. But still, the Apocrypha for Catholics, it doesn't change the structure of the Bible a whole lot other than an added section. But still, we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, so on and so forth. We're all used to this picture, and this is not just the fact that we have this collection of books, but we are used to the form of that collection. In other words, this collection is organized in a certain way. There's a certain order to the books. Likewise with the New Testament, we have a certain order that we are accustomed to. Well, the order of the books is just part of the canonization process. There are different orders. I mean, when you look at the rabbinic canon and compare that to the Protestant Old Testament, it's the exact same books, but they are placed in a different order. And order makes a difference with how we read things. In the Eastern churches, the churches of the East in Christianity, their New Testament is ordered differently than the New Testament that we are used to. It's the same books, but it's a different order. Most people are surprised to find out that Paul's letters were most likely written before the four Gospels. Now, they were written before certain of the Gospels at least, but when I say most likely, it's all of them. Some people think that Mark may have been written before some of Paul's letters and things like that. But Paul's letters came first. So if you want to read the New Testament chronologically in terms of writing dates, then you'd have to start with Paul's letters or perhaps some of the other letters that are in the New Testament. But the Gospels would be coming closer to the end of it. The reason why our New Testament is ordered the way it is has theological reasons that have to do with canon, and that involves political reasons and things like that as well, just in terms of there being a dominant theological group. So this influences how we read things. And case in point is today's study. Most people, by the way, today are familiar with Matthew because Matthew's the first one in the Bible. So people have a tendency of, okay, I want to start reading through the Bible, and maybe I'll start with the New Testament. So what happens is they'll start with Matthew because it's the first book in the New Testament. They'll start with Matthew and read through and, maybe have a daily reading plan, and then eventually it falls apart. They end up getting distracted with other elements of life. And then they're not in the habit of reading the Bible on a daily basis forever long, and maybe a couple years later, they'll want to read the Bible again. So, I'm going to start from the beginning of the New Testament again and read through. Well, and now they're reading Matthew more, and they haven't read the other ones. So Matthew is read more than the other Gospels. Genesis is read more than the rest of the books of the Old Testament. People say, I want to read the Bible, I'll start from the beginning. And then they get partway through, and they stop. And maybe they'll try it again, and they'll start at the beginning. These things happen all the time. And so Genesis is read a whole lot, and a lot of the other books are barely ever read, just by virtue of the fact that Genesis is at the beginning of the Bible. And the first chapters of Genesis are read even more than the rest because many people don't get through all of Genesis by the time they give up. So Genesis chapter 1 and 2, those chapters have been hugely influential on our society and on Christian theology and Jewish theology and so on because of the process of canonization. Now, this would have been very different if the canon developed differently. There are many other creation accounts. We'll end up listing them and we'll actually read them. Hopefully we'll get through all of them today. If the canon had been ordered differently and, say, Psalm 104, which is a creation account, if that had ended up at the beginning of the Bible, well, we would have a very different view of things. We would have a very different view of the world and of theology. We'd have different points of emphasis and so on. Psalm 104, by the way, it didn't have to be Psalm 104. There's just like there's an individual composition or basically there's an order that the canon took. There's orders that certain books of the Bible took. So we think of the Psalms as one book, when really the Psalms was 5 books at some point in the past, 5 separate collections of Psalms, and then each of those Psalms were individual Psalms. They were individual compositions. So just one moment here. Okay, so I just found out, actually, although you guys know what's going on, so I guess the Allens and the Spences, they're in their separate trailers, but none of them are getting reception. So they tried to drive out to the front of the property and to try and get reception there, but none of them are getting reception. So they're actually on their way over to the yurt. So we're all going to end up over here. So we might actually just wait a few minutes for them to get here. I know that we haven't gotten to any of the actual subject matter yet. It's been introductory material. But since we're waiting, does anyone have any comments or questions concerning what we've said by way of introduction?
I believe it.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, these are just important principles and important facts of history of how things have gone. We do apologize for the delay and everything, but we're glad that everyone's here. And what we'll do is recap things, and actually maybe we'll just pray again, ask our Heavenly Family for blessing now that everyone's here. I know that at the very beginning there were very few people on the call. So let's just do that, and then we'll kind of, I'll recap what we were talking about. Heavenly Family, Todah, once again, thank you. We're so glad to have everyone here and to be here for the new moon, and knowing that there is much substance that you have for us. Please help us as we consider these things. Help us to think rightly. Please bless each person here with the right attitude toward investigation. Surround each person with angels and help us to view these things to be much more than a theory, but to take them and relate them to our practical lives and to learn the lessons that we need to learn for the sake of righteousness and for the sake of your kingdom. So please bless us, Heavenly Family. We ask all these things, B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of French. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so far what we've went through is just introductory material. We haven't actually gotten to the substance of the subject. Basically, the subject is cosmogony, scriptural cosmogony, and I'll explain again what that word means. Cosmogony is related to the word cosmology. Cosmology is a composite of 2 words, cosmos and ology. I'm not sure if it's even a word, but it's at least a word ending. And basically, cosmos is the world or the universe. Ology is the study of or the understanding of. So biology, theology, Christology, all of these things are the study of and understanding of fill in the blank, whatever it is. So cosmology is the study of the universe or the study of the world and the understanding of the world. Cosmogony is still with cosmos. It's about the cosmos, but rather than being the study of or the understanding of, it is the origin of. The origin of the cosmos. So progeny has that ogeny sound. It's the origin of something. So we're going to be looking at scriptural cosmogony, the origin of the cosmos, according to the scriptures. Now, most of us are used to Genesis chapters 1 and 2 as being the go-to place and perhaps the only place for understanding the origin of the cosmos. But there are actually a number of other passages. In going through this yesterday and today in preparation for this meeting, inclusive of Genesis 1 and 2, there are 8 passages that I found which relate to our subject as being scriptural creation passages. And we'll list them. And as I mentioned before on the call, people may want to have notebooks or be at your computers or whatever other device that you have in order to take notes so that you can record the references and go through them later. We have a lot of ground to cover in this meeting, so we're going to be going fast, and at least as fast as our Heavenly Family leads, with still understanding the principles. It's not expected, of course, that everyone will understand all of the meanings of all of these passages right now, and I myself don't understand all of the aspects of all these passages, nor do I understand the implications of what the overall conclusion which we will reach today leads to. So we'll see where this all goes, but we're going to be looking at these other passages and see some clarifications on certain things. Some misunderstandings that we have had will be shown to be just that, misunderstandings. And then by looking at these other pictures, we will have a far broader view of scriptural cosmogony, origins of the cosmos. So where we left off was talking about how and why Genesis chapter 1 and 2 ended up being the place that we go to the most. So people often will say, I want to read the Bible, and they'll have a reading plan. And they'll start from Genesis because that's at the beginning of, quote-unquote, the Bible. So they'll read Genesis and get partway through, and then life might take over, and they end up not finishing their reading plan to get through the whole Bible. Maybe a couple of years later, they'll try again, and they start from Genesis again. Just like with the New Testament, Matthew is read a lot in comparison to the other books because people will try to read through the New Testament, start with Matthew, not get all the way through, and then maybe later try again. It's just the natural starting place with how the canon has been organized. So we have learned in this message that the canon is not a heaven-appointed thing. Certain books within the canon may be appointed by heaven, may have been prompted and inspired by heavenly intelligences. But the canon, as a set list of books, organized in a particular way, is not something that heaven appointed for us. These are things which various communities have developed within their communities with different results. So the rabbinic canon, the Hebrew Bible, is actually the same collection of books as the Protestant Old Testament. And the reason for that is because Protestants adopted the rabbinic canon, but they had a different ordering to the books. They kept with the Christian ordering, the classical Christian ordering through the centuries. So it ends up being a different canon because it's a different ordering of the books, even though it's the same books. The ordering of the books makes a difference. We end up getting a picture in our minds of the development of Christianity by the order of the books in our New Testament when that's not necessarily an accurate depiction. For instance, all of the letters of Paul were written most likely before at least 3, perhaps all 4 of the Gospels in the New Testament. But when we read it in reverse order, we get a different picture. Another clear example of this is the ordering of the Gospels being Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then you have Acts, when really Acts is a part 2 to Luke. The author of Luke wrote the book of Acts, and the book of Acts is a natural continuation of Luke, not of John or of Matthew or Mark. So ordering it as Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts has actually distorted that reality, where many people are not aware of the fact that Acts is a continuation of Luke. So the order of books makes a big difference. Psalm 104 is another of the creation accounts in the Bible. If that had been placed at the beginning of the canon, and Genesis 1 and 2 ended up being just somewhere else later in the canon, then most likely Psalm 104 would be more popular, and Genesis 1 and 2 would be less familiar to people. People wouldn't be as aware of it, and it would have a far smaller impact on our theologies and our society. Because Genesis 1 and 2, again, it has had a huge impact on our society. Those are probably the two most read chapters of the Bible, period. But again, doing this, what ends up happening is when we talk about scriptural creation accounts and so on, we have a focus on those two chapters to the exclusion of the others. And as I mentioned before, there are 10 in total that I have found yesterday and today that we're going to go through at least. There are more. I'll mention Psalm 33 is also a creation account, or includes a creation account. But we're not going to go through that today because it doesn't relate as directly, and we already have so much to go through. So that's the story. We have these different accounts. What we will do is start with the one with which we are most familiar, and that's Genesis 1. This is more popular than Genesis 2, but Genesis chapter 1 is where we will start. And what we're going to do is remove some of our preconceived ideas in relation to it. And actually, we've done this a little bit already, even just in our discussions this last weekend. We talked a little bit about Genesis and just through the past and understanding materialism and understanding that the authors of the various books of Scripture were materialists. We've seen that these writings are not teaching a doctrine known as creation ex nihilo, which is creation from nothing. Nothing is non-matter. Immaterial is the same idea. The origin of the universe is not non-matter. Non-matter is not part of what exists to even be discussed. It's just all we can say is that it doesn't exist, and that's about all that we can say concerning it. So matter is the nature of the universe. And when you read Genesis, it's, when it talks about the forming of Adam in Genesis 2, to kind of skip ahead there, it describes Adam being formed from the dust of the earth. Well, that's matter. And it says that Adam was created. So in Genesis, you don't have the word create being used as something from nothing. It's forming something from previously existing matter in the instance of Genesis 2 with Adam. And also later with the woman in Genesis 2, she's taken from the substance that is man. This is just to let us know. I'm not aware of any occurrence of the word bara, which is the Hebrew word for creation. I'm not aware of any ancient occurrence of that word which is in the context of something from nothing. So it's not actually talking about the origins of the matter. It's making something to be what it is. And that could be defined differently in different contexts. So we'll have to keep that in mind. Also, we looked or discussed this weekend the first two verses of Genesis chapter 1. I'll read those verses here again. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was without shape and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the watery deep. But the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water. And that's the reading from the NET. Of course, it'll be slightly different in different translations. But we talked about how this isn't necessarily the best translation. And if you hear background noise, it's because it's a windy day. And so if there's a loud noise, I'll try and pause and then speak again. So if I pause, it's not necessarily because we were cut off. It could be just pausing because of the noise of the wind. So as we talked about, another way to translate the first verse of Genesis is when God began to create the heavens and the earth. Going into verse 2, the earth was without form and void, or the earth was in a state of chaos and disorder. That latter reading, when God began to create, is supported by the Masoretic text with the vowel pointing. And also, that reading is more in harmony with the Septuagint. So the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And also medieval Jewish interpreters had that same understanding. So you see that understanding of when God began to create the heavens and the earth was without form and void, etc., etc. That understanding goes back far into ancient times. So therefore, most likely the originally intended meaning. And there's other reasons for believing that. But we can actually take that understanding back even to the time of Isaiah, for instance. So Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18 says this: "For this is what Yahweh says, the one who created the sky. He is the true God, the one who formed the earth and made it and established it. He did not create it without order." Okay, that word for without order is tohu. That's the one that in Genesis 1, verse 2 is translated formless. So here Isaiah is saying God did not create the earth formless. Well, if we take Genesis 1, verse 1, and then go into verse 2 as, 1 is describing God creating the heavens and the earth, and 2 is now the earth that he created, and it's formless and void. Well, let's just say that that's not the understanding of the creation that Isaiah had. Isaiah had the understanding that God created the world to be ordered, not to be tohu. The word tohu is better translated as chaos, not formless. So again, what this is showing is that the ancient Jewish understanding represented through the Septuagint and through Isaiah, and this carries into the Masoretic text and medieval Judaism, the understanding is that the world was in a state of chaos and confusion. Tohu wavohu is the Hebrew phrase. Before the creation. That's how the earth was before the creation. And then when God went to create it, he changed that to no longer be in a state of confusion and chaos. So, again, this is saying that Genesis 1 being part of the literature of ancient Judaism and seeing as the better translation is when God began to create the heavens and the earth was without form and void, so on and so forth, or in a state of chaos and confusion, disorder. That translation is better, and that's more in keeping with the understanding of ancient Judaism. So the earth here is not the post-creation earth, it is the pre-creation earth, which already kind of changes how we might view things, because what do we mean, pre-creation earth? If you think it's created from nothing, then you would think that there was no earth to be there pre-creation. This is showing that prior to the earth being created, the earth existed. So creation there is not referring to the material origins of the world itself. It's talking about something else happening to the earth. So we have this thing, it's the earth, it's in a state of chaos and confusion. Darkness is over the surface of the watery deep. Okay, so there's a watery deep. That's interesting. It's not nothing, it's something. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water. Water is something, not nothing. So this is talking about previously existing matter. We won't go through this right now, but I'm going to reference a few scriptures that you can look up for the phrase or for the word tohu, which is what is translated in the King James as without form. Genesis. Oh, sorry, not Genesis. Yes, go ahead.
Would you repeat the Isaiah reference again?
Sure. The Isaiah reference is Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18. And our purpose here is to quote it to show how Isaiah understood that the earth was not created to be formless, to be tohu, to be in a state of chaos. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so some other passages that can just help to inform the understanding of what the word tohu means is Deuteronomy 32, verse 10, and Isaiah 24, verse 10. Also, actually, Psalm 107, verse 40, Job chapter 6, verse 18, and Job chapter 12, verse 24, and also from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Damascus document, which is abbreviated as capital C, capital D. That's the short for the Damascus document. Column 1, line 15. All of those references describe things in a state of chaos. It describes things being, like even in the Damascus document, the word tohu there is translated as wilderness. Well, wilderness isn't formless in the sense of having no physical form. It's just, it hasn't been built up. Nothing's been done with it. It's just in a state of what it is, confusion. Not any particular order to it. So that is what is being described by this word. The word vohu only occurs 3 times in the Bible. One is here in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, and again, I'm using the word Bible there within a Protestant canon context, which isn't particularly meaningful, but just so that people can have the references in the books that you're used to. So it's Genesis 1, verse 2, that has vohu, Isaiah 34, verse 11, and Jeremiah 4, verse 23. It does occur more times in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we're not going to go through the references for that. But the word vohu in ancient Jewish literature, to my knowledge, only occurs in connection with tohu. So it's only tohu wa vohu. That's the only thing, or you'll have it, those two words together. And it's talking, about a waste, a type of waste or a desolate condition. That's vohu. So when it says that the earth was without form and void, or it's better translated, it is in a state of chaos and disorder. So again, when God began to create the sky and the earth was in a state of chaos and disorder, and darkness was over the surface of the watery deep. But the Spirit of Elohim was moving over the surface of the water. So that's giving us a bit better of an understanding, right? It's not talking about some poof into existence experience. It's talking about something is there, this is its state, and this is what it was like when God began to create. Genesis 1, verse 3. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, so God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness night. There was evening, and there was morning, marking the first day. Okay, so that's creation, day 1. And we're not going to be able to go through every day in detail. But we're just going to ask some questions, go through some things that show that we've had misconceptions. So we have to understand different people at different times of the Earth's history in different locations on the world have different worldviews. We have different assumptions, different beliefs through which we view everything. All of us in the modern-day Western world are children of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment has radically changed how we view all things. We have what some people call a scientific worldview. To us, we think of atoms. We think of particles. We think of all this. That is not how people view things commonly in the ancient world. They didn't understand the idea of atoms. They didn't understand all these other things, molecules and this and that. Most people in the ancient world thought that there were certain elements that everything kind of boiled down to. Like some people thought everything ultimately boils down to a certain type of liquid or like a watery type substance. Some people thought it was another type of substance. Others thought that there were 4 main elements: earth, wind, fire, water, things like that. We don't come from that perspective. We don't view the world in today's society as being a flat disk on water with a solid dome sky. This is, though, how people view things typically in the ancient world. And, Jews, in their perspective, and this is throughout Scripture as well and ancient Jewish literature, Jerusalem was the center of the disk of the earth. For Romans, Rome was the center. For Babylonians, Babylon was the center. All these different people, where they were, they believed to be the center. Different people had these conceptions. So we have to say, okay, we are coming at this from a radically different perspective. So when we think, oh, let there be light, we're thinking of particles of light, photons. We're thinking of God makes this happen. Well, in the ancient world, they didn't think of photons. They didn't think of these things. They're thinking of the experience of light and darkness. Like, hey, the sun's shining. We have light. We can see things. Okay, well, it's nighttime. We can't see things. That's darkness. It was thinking of things in that sort of way. So when God creates light, is this possibly even claiming that he created photons? Well, no, because they're not thinking of photons. So that's not the claim that's being made. And this is further borne out in verse 5 where it says, and God called the light, what did he call the light?
Day.
He called it day. Why did he call the light day? Why didn't he call the light photons? Or why didn't he call the light light and the darkness darkness? It's because what he's making isn't light in the scientific sense. It's not darkness in the scientific sense. It's a period of light and a period of darkness. So what is day? It's a period of light. What is darkness? It's a period of, what is night? A period of darkness. So it's not talking about creating light itself. It's talking about separating things. And that's why it says, he saw the light was good. So God separated the light from the darkness. The way that the creation of light is described here is light being separated or divided from darkness. Again, that's a period of light from a period of darkness, not scientific light from scientific darkness. In fact, it's impossible scientifically to separate light from darkness because darkness is simply the absence of light. There is no light in darkness to separate from it. So they aren't thinking of this from the perspective of a scientific worldview. So for us to come to it and try to make it be speaking from a scientific worldview is actually to butcher the text. Yes?
Could we just equate this with more modern-day messengers? There were things that Ellen White said in her writings that weren't accurate, and things that Victor Hada said and everybody, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing, and that's what you're saying.
Well, I'm just saying it's accurate to what it's trying to put across. So Genesis is accurate in what it's trying to put across. It's just not trying to put across what we think it's trying to put across.
Right, we're reading more into it based on what we know today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now that we know what causes night and day, could it be said that this is where God set the earth in motion? Set it spinning?
That though, the issue with that is that that's assuming a spinning earth, whereas the ancient writers did not assume a spinning earth. They believed that everything was going around the earth. They had a geocentric universe. They believed that all the stars, all like the sun, the moon, the stars, all of that was very close to the earth, which they envisioned as a stable disk on foundations going into the water. And so they wouldn't be thinking of this at all in terms of spinning or anything like that. So we can't carry that into our interpretation of Genesis because it's a very different thing. So we have to come to try and understand what Genesis is saying in its own right and understand it within its own context.
From the viewpoint of the writer.
Yeah, that's right, from the viewpoint of the writer. Another thing that I think is worth saying, we can ask things like, okay, is day one of creation a 24-hour period? And most of us would say, yeah, it's a 24-hour period. But the question is, what constitutes a 24-hour period? And how can you know that if you don't know what an hour is? So let me ask you, scripturally speaking, what is an hour?
1/12 of the day.
1/12 of a day? Okay, well, 1/12 of how? What do you mean by of a day? All right, so here's the thing. An hour is determined by, you take the time from sunrise to sunset. You divide it into 12 equal portions, and those are your daytime hours. They didn't have minutes. They didn't have a clock. They didn't have anything like that. Initially, nighttime in the ancient world was not divided into hours. They had night watches. Some people would divide it into 3 sections, some people 4 sections. And then eventually, of course, they divided night into hours as well by dividing from sunset to sunrise into 12 equal periods. So you had night hours. So hours were of varying lengths for day and for night. So if you say that this is a 24-hour period, that may very well be the case. But that implies something. Even using the phrase evening and morning, the first day, evening throughout Scripture is equivalent with sunset. Morning is equivalent with sunrise. So you have things like that. You're like, okay, well, there's something going on here that we need to be aware of that shows that our typical understanding of this falls short. Going on from this, I won't be reading all this because this isn't intended to be a detailed study on Genesis 1. But what we have is day 2, which is basically what we would typically think of as the creation of, quote-unquote, the sky. And people have different understandings of what this means. But most understandings today, unsurprisingly, are attempting to understand this within a scientific worldview, because that's the way we think. So when we come to it, we're trying to understand it in that light. And so we think that this is the creation of the sky, but what exactly is the sky? So people think, oh, this is the atmosphere. Well, our concept of atmosphere has no place in the ancient world. They had nothing like that at all. So what is it exactly? Well, what it actually describes in Genesis 1, verses 6 to 8, is the creation of a dome that separated water. Water was put above the dome, and water was put below the dome, and below the earth, really. At least it ends up being below the earth throughout the next day. But this is a dome. The word that's used in Hebrew for the firmament or the expanse in some other translations is rakia, and it literally means basically a beaten sheet substance. It's used like, I'll give you some references. Numbers 16:38. The same word, rakia, is used for a beaten metal plate. Also, it can be used as a verb to mean to beat something out. So in Exodus 39:3, and in Numbers 16:39, Numbers 17:4, Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 9. All of those instances describe the beating out of things, and it's this word rakia, and it's a verb form. And this word is actually specifically used in speaking about God making the sky in its verb form in Isaiah 42, verse 5, and Isaiah 44, verse 24. Again, that's Isaiah 42, 5, and Isaiah 44, verse 24. In certain other translations, or in some translations, it's translated as he stretches out the heavens, or he stretched out the heavens. Really, it's he beat out the heavens. He beat out the sky, the solid dome of the sky. That's what the word rakia means. There's also Job 37, verse 18, which clearly says that the sky is solid. It says, can you join him in beating out the sky, hard as a mirror of cast bronze? Well, can you join God in beating out the sky to be hard as a mirror of cast bronze? Well, that's just really plain. Sure, different translations have it differently. People who translate it from the perspective of a scientific worldview, who don't want it to say that, can translate it in a way that's less clear, but still, I think most translations, you can see that, it's talking about a solid sky, really, really clearly. So that's what Genesis 1, verse 2 is describing. Genesis 1, verses 6 to 8, describing the second day of creation. It's the creation of this solid disk, or solid dome, that is conceived to be the sky, and there's waters above it, waters below it. Later in Genesis chapter 8, it talks about opening the windows of heaven. There's the floodgates of heaven that are spoken of through Scripture. Again, this isn't a study on scriptural cosmology, the way that the universe is understood, so we're not going to go through all these details, but this is just to mention, hey, this is very different from what we are used to. Going to day 3, what happens? Well, it's the gathering of water into one place to let dry ground appear. Interesting. Now, it doesn't say, poof, dry ground appearing. It's gathering the waters to let dry ground appear, implying that dry ground, or at least ground, was already there, and it becomes dry by moving the waters. And then it says, in chapter 1, verse 11, so Genesis 1, verse 11, God said, let the land produce vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their kinds, etc., etc. So what produces the vegetation? Is this describing God saying, let there be vegetation out of nothing? No, God is saying, let the land produce vegetation. This is a different thing. We're not used to observing these facts, but this is simply what it says. Now, notice here, we've gone through these first 3 days. So far, it hasn't actually described the material origin of anything. It's described separating things, and it's described gathering things together, like, separating light from darkness, creating these periods of day and night. It's described moving water from one place to another. It's described the earth bringing forth produce. These are all not describing the origin of the matter of anything. It's not actually a description of material origins. Likewise, the next 3 days are not describing the material origins of anything. Now, the first 3 days of creation actually parallel the next 3 days. It's kind of like it discusses the domains in the first 3 days, and then it populates the domains. So, let there be light. Well, what happens? You have day and night. Well, then what are the things that occupy the domains of day and night? Day 4, well, you have the sun, moon, and stars. Right? That occupies the domains of day and night. And the way it describes them is for functional purposes. It describes them as, let them be for signs and seasons, days, months, years. You have that sort of thing in day 4. It's establishing them to be for a particular purpose. Day 5. Well, what was day 2 again? Well, you have the creation of the sky, and you have separation. You have the basically the distance or the space between Earth and the solid sky. What happens in day 5? Well, let the water swarm with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. Okay, so now you have populating the domains of water. So day 2, you have the separation of water above and below and the space between. Okay, so now we have creatures inhabiting the water, and now we have the sky being inhabited as well. That's the basic thing that happens here in day 5. Day 6, Genesis 1, verse 24. God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds. Okay, so are living creatures just getting poofed into existence? Does God say, let living creatures suddenly exist out of nothing? No. Let the land produce living creatures. That's really interesting. It's saying that the land is what produced the living creatures. Different. And by the way, some people will say, oh, that's just like evolution, coming from walk and this and that. Well, again, that would be imposing a later view upon this writing. The theory of evolution did not exist when Genesis was written. So it's not speaking of things within that context. So you can't say, oh, well, it says the land, so therefore it's teaching evolution or something. No, that's just imposing a later worldview back onto Genesis, just like how people do who think that Genesis is saying that something's being made out of absolutely nothing. So these are all important things to keep in mind. But it's to say, hey, look, something different is going on. It is kind of weird that it says let the land produce living creatures. And then, of course, there's the creation of mankind, humanity. Let us make mankind in our image, so on and so forth. Male and female, they were created, all of that. And then they are supposed to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. Interesting, the word subdue there. Actually, throughout Scripture, it means something like conquer or even enslave. It's used like that. So to conquer the world, that sort of thing. And then the man and woman are established as governors of the world, as having dominion over it, caring for the animals, and so on. And then we have the end of the 6th day, and the next day is actually in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 3 of Genesis actually belong to the content of Genesis 1. It would have made way more sense to do the chapter break after what we now have as Genesis 2, verse 3. Because it's the heavens and the earth were completed and everything that was in them. By the 7th day, God finished the work he had been doing and ceased on the 7th day all the work he had been doing. God blessed the 7th day and made it holy because on it he ceased all the work that he had been doing in creation. So that's the end of it. Now there's a lot more to creation and so on. But basically it's the day of rest, the 7th day in this whole telling of the origin of the world is the day of rest. And it's the day when things are finally done. And actually in the ancient world, there are a number of different creation accounts. A number of them have 7-day creations. And there are a number of other things that are 7-day experiences. inaugurating temples was typically a 7-day ritual in the ancient world, and even building a temple in a god building a temple is described like that. So, for instance, in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 9, we have the record of how Solomon's temple had a 7-day inauguration. There's also passages that equate the cosmos with a temple. Psalm 78, verse 69. There's other passages that also equate the cosmos with being like a temple and connect it with rest. Isaiah 66, verse 1, Psalm 132, verses 7 and 8, and verses 13 and 14. I know we're going quick, but we just have so much to cover, we kind of have to. But all of this shows basically the idea. In the ancient world, someone reading Genesis 1 would, when they get to the end of it especially, realize, okay, yeah, God has done his work now, and now it's the 7th day, and he's resting from his work. Well, that is the same as being seated in a temple. It's like his resting place. The temple is called the resting place, the sanctuary, things like that. So there are different places. There's a text from Babylonian literature that describes, this is, may not be from Babylonian literature. This is from Ugaritic literature, and it's describing Baal building his temple over a period of 7 days. He does different things on each of the 7 days, throughout 6 of them, and then on the 7th day, he's done, and he rests in his temple. So that's showing this kind of temple theology and how it relates to creation. Also, there are a number of things within the structure of the temple that are patterned after creation. That's a whole other study in itself that we won't be going into right now. That is the first creation account. That's the first one that we are used to. Notice how it's different than what we're typically used to conceiving when reading it. Just by pointing out a few things, we can see, you know what? Yeah, this isn't saying the things that we thought it was saying. In fact, it's not even describing the material origins of the world. It's describing something that has to do with God being enthroned in the temple, and it's bringing order out of chaos. And as we get to the end of today's study, that will become more evident, and a broader context of that will be more plain. The next creation account is contained in Genesis chapter 2, verses 4 to 25. Now, some of you may be wondering why I said the next creation account. Typically in reading Genesis, we're used to thinking of it as just one creation account. But it's actually kind of different, and we're going to go through and we're going to see why. Now, I'm going to have to recap a few things from previous studies right now in order for this all to make sense. And for those of you who may have missed certain of these studies, this may be wholly new. And that's unfortunate, because I think it would be helpful to have an understanding of this element that I'm about to mention ahead of time. So if what I'm about to say is new to you, and if it's a shock, I just ask for you to remember the principles of investigation. Ellen White, of course, talked about how the character by which we approach the investigation of the Scriptures determines the attitude with which we approach the investigation of the Scriptures determines the character of the assistant at our side. So if we come with a negative attitude, well, who is going to be influencing us? Not the angels of light, but the angels of darkness. If we come with the right, honest, candid attitude of investigation, we will have heavenly intelligences to guide us. So just keep in mind the principles of investigation. Okay, so I'll go back to something. This is something we went through on the last day of the offering of the wave sheaf, or the most recent offering of the wave sheaf day, so just after Passover this year. We talked about the authorship of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, typically called the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah. And what we found is that the 5 the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, does not claim to be written by Moses. Ancient writings, just like modern writings, typically claim authorship either at the beginning or at the end. In following Genesis through Deuteronomy, you can see that in its current form, it is one narrative. Exodus continues on from the end of Genesis. Leviticus continues on from the end of Exodus. Numbers does the same, and Deuteronomy does the same. But either way, if you take those 5 books as 5 separate books, at the beginning and end of each, there is no claim to authorship at all. They are all written anonymously, and at the beginning and end of the 5 books as a whole, they are written anonymously. There's nothing to actually that makes an open claim to authorship. And then we had to look through other things like, okay, well, can we look through it and see what does it claim in terms of authorship? Or since there's no actual claims, are there any indications that are given in regards to who didn't write it or who did? And so you have a particular suggestion that you can test. Like most people suggest that Moses wrote it. Can we test that hypothesis? Yes, we can test that hypothesis. First, again, it doesn't make the claim. So if it doesn't make the claim, why make the hypothesis to begin with? In other words, the burden of proof is not on those who wish to disrepute that claim. The burden of proof is on those who make the claim. First thing that I'll mention is that Moses, throughout the Pentateuch, is spoken of biographically as opposed to autobiographically. An autobiography is someone writing their own life story. A biography is someone else writing someone's life story. When you read what the Pentateuch says about Moses, it doesn't say I unless it quotes him. The fact that it has to quote him shows that it's being written in a biographical setting, not as an autobiography. So it talks about Moses and this little baby put in the basket and all of that in the reeds, his being named, him doing all these things, giving the laws, the wilderness wandering, the him being becoming a shepherd, and the whole Exodus experience. Everything is written from the perspective of a narrator speaking about Moses, not from the perspective of Moses himself. So that's a very significant indication that, okay, yes, this is not in any way claiming to be written by Moses. So we're going to hang up and call back, and then we'll continue discussing this. Okay, we are back. We'll just continue on. We're discussing the claim that Moses wrote the Pentateuch and seeing how so far there's no evidence for it, and in fact it indicates otherwise. There are specific things throughout the Pentateuch that Moses could not have written. Again, we're not going to go through and ask questions and do things as we've done before in our previous studies. I'm just recapping things. So, for instance, Genesis chapter 12, verse 6 says, Abram traveled through the land as far as the oak tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Okay, so Genesis 12, verse 6, when it says, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land, it's distinguishing that time, the time that Abraham traveled through the land as far as the oak of the tree of Moreh at Shechem, it's distinguishing that time from the time of the author. At that time, the time of Abram, Canaanites were in the land. Why state that if Canaanites were still in the land? There would be no need. You wouldn't say at that time. Just like no one is going to say, oh, at that time, Americans, were in America, or Canadians were in Canada. No one is going to say that if Canadians are in Canada and Americans are in America. It's only if America was to come to an end and be taken over by a foreign power and something like that, then you could refer back to history and say, at that time, Americans were in this land. No, this is at that time, Canaanites were in the land. So this must have been written at a time when Canaanites were no longer in the land. And there was no time when Canaanites were no longer in the land during the life of Moses. Moses died before the conquest of Canaan. he died on the other side of Jordan, which we'll get to that in a moment. He died before crossing the Jordan. So Moses could not have written Genesis chapter 12, verse 6. So this whole thing of the other side of Jordan, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1 says, these are the words which Moses spoke on the other side of Jordan, so on and so forth. Then it says the things that Moses spoke, not in the land, of course, but on the side of the Jordan that is opposite the land of promise. So if the author of Deuteronomy is saying Moses said these things on the other side of Jordan, and the other side of Jordan is the wilderness, then it's being spoken from the perspective of being inside the land. Well, Moses wasn't inside the land, so he couldn't have written this. So that's showing something that indicates to us, again, that this was not written by Moses. Also, blazingly clear is Deuteronomy chapter 34, which describes the death of Moses and his burial. Well, Moses could not very well write about his own death and burial. And again, it speaks of him in third person in a biographical sense rather than as if Moses himself wrote it. So, then Moses ascended from the desert of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the summit of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. The Lord showed him the whole land, so on and so forth, etc., etc. Verse 5, so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in the land of Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in the land of Moab near Beth Peor, but no one knows the exact place, or his exact burial place, to this very day. Okay, when it says to this very day, it's implying that the day when Moses was buried was in the distant past from the day in which this is written. So, you wouldn't make a statement like that if it happened last year. This is in the distant past. No one knows his exact burial place to this very day. Now, going on, still in Deuteronomy 34, it says in verse 9, now Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had placed his hands on him, and the Israelites listened to him and did just what the Lord had commanded Moses. No prophet ever again arose in Israel like Moses, who knew the Lord face to face. Okay, so if you're referring back to Moses and saying no prophet ever again arose in Israel like Moses, you're referring to that as something in the distant past. So this was written a lengthy time. How long is something that has to be discovered. But it's a lengthy time after Moses. And to get a little bit of a glimpse of how far after, there's one more verse that I'll read. This is from Genesis 36:31. These were the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king ruled over the Israelites. Okay, so now that's distinguishing between the time that's being referred to and the time in which the author wrote this, just like Genesis 12, verse 6. So these were the kings, it's describing certain kings. These were the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king ruled over the Israelites. Well, you couldn't say before any king ruled over the Israelites if you're writing at a time when there had never been a king ruling over the Israelites. So what this shows is that this is written at a time after kings had ruled over Israelites. So this is at least after the days of Saul and David and most likely Solomon. It's talking about the period of the kings. So from this, we can determine that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, this was written way after the time of Moses. This was written after the time even of David and of Solomon. There's other indications that are more thorough where we can determine who wrote the Pentateuch, not just who didn't. And we'll talk about that a little bit in this meeting. So this is really something important. It changes our perspective of everything. Well, if Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, who did? That's kind of the next question to be asked. But it's important to realize that he didn't. One of the other things that this changes is when we read through the Psalms and we hear speaking about creation, it's common for us to think, oh, David's referring back to Genesis. No, Genesis didn't exist. So some of the other creation accounts that we are going to look at are actually older than the Genesis account. So, for instance, a number of these Psalms, critical scholars looking at these Psalms say this goes back to the 10th century, to the 11th century, all these things. That's the time of David. You can verify that a number of these Psalms were actually written at the time of David. It expresses ideas, it uses vocabulary, even just the Hebrew language. We've mentioned before how Hebrew has developed over time. You can actually determine by inscriptions that were found that the Hebrew of the Psalms is older than the Hebrew of Genesis, just by comparing inscriptions. Like you can dig up an inscription from the 8th century BCE, and people have done this. And the way that they can know that it's the 8th century BCE is because you'll have something, it's like a pot or whatever, and it'll have an inscription on it, and inside the pot it'll have a coin saying, such and such a year of King so-and-so. So you can actually determine historically when they dig up coins in archaeological layers, that really helps to verify the time of the objects that they are digging up. So coins are among the most common things for archaeologists to find. And they have found Hebrew inscriptions dating back to the 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th, all these different centuries. They found inscriptions which can show them the development of the Hebrew language, both in terms of grammar, vocabulary, syntax, and in terms of Hebrew writing style. Paleography is the actual form that the letters take. So this helps to verify when certain things were written. So we have these various aspects to keep in mind. The next question is, if Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, who did? Now, I'm sure that some of you guys may have noticed that lately, when we've been asking questions of authorship concerning different texts, I haven't just asked who has written this, or, talking about we have to keep the perspective of the author in mind. You may have noticed that I've said the author or authors. That's because not every text has been written by one author. Some texts are actually a composite of originally separate works. And sometimes those separate works could be by the same author, and sometimes by different authors. I'll give you guys a contemporary or a more contemporary example. In A Word to the Little Flock, on page 16, and actually the surrounding pages as well, there are two visions of Ellen White, her first vision and the vision of the new earth, which we now understand to be the vision of the seven thunders. They were originally two separate visions, which Ellen White wrote down separately. But for the purposes of publishing it in A Word to the Little Flock, they were combined to read like one account. And on page 16, there's a place that says, "We all descended from this place down to a city, and with Jesus at our head, we all descended," so on and so forth. Okay, well, here's the thing. Where one vision stops and the other begins is actually in the middle of a sentence, between the word and with. So if you read Ellen White's original written form of this account, it starts like this: "With Jesus at our head, we all descended from the city down to this earth." The way it is in A Word to the Little Flock is, "We all descended from this place down into the city, and with Jesus at our head, we all descended from the city down to this earth." So you see how it's actually combined, and what it combines is one sentence. That's the division part, just in one sentence. But it's a composite of two originally separate writings. So that's important to keep in mind, that this is possible. It happens in modern times, and it happened in ancient times. The Book of Enoch, it is written in such a way that makes it clear that it is originally composed of separate books. And in fact, in the Ethiopian version of the Book of Enoch, it'll say Book 1 in the manuscripts, the Ethiopian manuscripts. Book 1. And then when you read it, it's okay, the book of the beginning of the vision which Enoch saw. Then the other one, the book of the luminaries, which Enoch saw. The book of the, so it starts off saying the book of the, for these different sections, and you read it, and it sounds like the beginning of a writing. So these were originally separate writings, and then they were compiled into one thing. And among those 5 books, they actually may have been the composite of other writings put together, different sources that were taken and compiled into what we now have as the Book of Enoch, or 1 Enoch. That's an ancient example. The community rule. There's different versions of the community rule found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that there were 11 copies of it. Some copies start with what in 11QS is column 5. It's missing the first 4 columns of that 11QS. And those versions are shown to actually be the older versions. So that shows that 1QS, what we think of as the community rule today, is actually a composite of separate documents into one document. Victor Hoddeth even did this in times. I think Doug did this at times, where he had separate documents pulled together. I mean, the Conflict of the Ages series, Patriarchs and Prophets, that was a whole bunch of Signs of the Times articles. And then they were compiled into a book. This happens all the time. Sometimes it's really obvious. Sometimes, like in A Words Below Flock, it's less obvious. And this, like you guys may have heard Doug's experience in understanding that part of the vision and reading it in A Words Below Flock, but being so confused as to the first part. You know, what is this? I'll tell you, there's a psalm that I read, and our Heavenly Family gave me the understanding of this psalm for the first 12 verses. And then it made no sense. It made no sense. And I was like, what is up with that? Like, that doesn't even make sense. How come they show me these first 12 verses, and then it seems like it just totally doesn't relate? So I looked into it. And it turns out that the rest of the verses, by the way, it's Psalm 40. And for those of you guys who want to write it down, this is a composite psalm. Psalm 40 is a composite of 2 separate psalms. The first 12 verses are one psalm. And then verses 13 to 17 are another psalm. The reason why we know for sure that it was another psalm, and the reason why it was confirmed to me that it's a separate composition, is because it's actually a separate psalm in the collection of psalms that we have. Psalm 70 and Psalm 40, verses 13 to 17, are the same. So that shows you that verses 13 to 17, those words, that content, circulated as a separate psalm from Psalm 40, from the first part. And then later someone came and they put them together, and it looks like it's one psalm. Right? So this shows that things can be gathered and collected. And if that can be done, it shows that it's not necessarily even the writings of the same author all the time. So when it comes to the Pentateuch is a very long, complex writing. We have to at least consider the possibility of it having multiple authors. And actually, this is something which scholars, not theologians, not apologists for different denominations who are just arguing the positions of that denomination, but scholars who have continued on the Protestant investigation. You know, remember, people like Martin Luther and Melanchthon and Wesley, like all these different reformers, they were studying the Bible to understand what it's really about. And they asked questions about authorship. Luther did not think that James wrote James. He did not think that Jude, the brother of Christ, wrote Jude. He did not think that John, the disciple, wrote Revelation. He thought that none of those writings were written by the people claimed to have written them, and he actually rejected those writings. He did not accept a theology of Scripture canon. He didn't accept the idea of, well, here we have this set list, and we have to keep with this list. No. Unfortunately, Protestants settled. But there were some people who ended up continuing on with a more critical investigation with a more historical approach to the Bible. And that ended up being what we now have as scholars, not denominational scholars, but critical scholars, critical scholarship, some of which, some of them are Christian, some of them are Jewish, some of them are Muslim, some of them are atheists, some of them are agnostics, some of them are Hindu, it's not a denominational perspective or anything like that. It's a wide variety of people who study the Bible not from a devotional religious standpoint. So if you go to a secular university today, you'll go to, like Harvard or Yale or whatever, they have courses on religion. But it would be wrong, and actually this is very much in keeping with Adventism. Adventism, like A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagner talked about the Bible and its use in public education, and how it would be wrong to teach the Bible perspective, biblical perspectives from a public university or school, because that's promoting a religious perspective. Then you have church and state. So it's wrong to actually teach a biblical perspective, as in teaching it as fact. But you can teach what the Bible says. You can teach about the Bible. You can do a historical course concerning the Bible, the history of the Bible, and all these things. And that's actually what they do in universities that are secular universities. So Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Princeton, whatever. You have these secular universities that approach things, Caltech even, or California State. It's not Caltech, it's Long Beach, actually, California. All these different universities have that. And among these universities, they actually teach that there are multiple authors to the Pentateuch. And there's a dominant understanding for the past 100 years or so. It's called the documentary hypothesis. And for a long time, I wasn't aware of the documentary hypothesis, but recently I've become aware of it, and it's something to investigate, because basically we've already found that it wasn't written by Moses. The documentary hypothesis basically states that there were that the Pentateuch as we have it now is a composite work written by multiple sources that were then brought together. And there's a lot of work on this. It'll be good for people to study in more detail at some point, but it's not the purpose of today's study to get into a lot of detail. But the sources are typically designated as J, E, P, and D. It's viewed that there are 4 primary sources for the Pentateuch. The way that the documentary hypothesis started was that people noticed what they called doublets. A doublet is a story that repeats. So, for instance, you have 2 times that Jacob is blessed at Bethel, 2 times that Abraham lies about Sarah, 2 times. There's actually over 30 doublets throughout the Pentateuch. There's over 30 of them where you have basically the same story told twice in different ways, and the accounts vary. And even the creation account, which is why we're getting into this, there's a doublet in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. These are 2 originally independent accounts of the same thing, but that are very different. And the way the documentary hypothesis started was that people started to recognize that in one set of these stories, God is referred to by names like El, Elohim, Eloah, El Shaddai, these El-type names. But then in the other version of the same story, God is referred to as Yahweh. So it's like, okay, wait a second. Why is it that you have, first, why do you have these double stories all throughout? Why is it that 2 times this happened with Abraham, lying about Sarah? 2 times Jacob is blessed at Bethel, and it's so similar. And then you find out that, okay, in all those instances, in one story, God is referred to as El and the various forms of El. And the other story, God is referred to as Yahweh. And it's like, okay, what's the deal with that? And so then that's what started it, saying, okay, well, maybe it's just written by different sources. So J is representative of the name Yahweh. It's because the scholars who originally found this were German scholars, and they would, it would be Yahweh, or in English, going from German to English, it's Jehovah. So they would refer to it as the J source, the source that has those stories referring to Yahweh as Yahweh all throughout. And then the other source that used L and all that is called the E source. So you have the Yahwists and the Elohists is how they refer to these things. So you have these different sources. And then they found, there's actually another source. They call it P, the priestly source. And then they found that Deuteronomy is very different from the other books, and they call it D, the D source, Deuteronomist. And there's Deuteronomistic histories going through the Bible. This whole thing, actually, these sources reach beyond the Pentateuch. It goes to the books of Joshua and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, those books as well. So they found these different sources and then developed means of identifying which parts were written by these different sources and identifying who these sources are. In other words, who are these various authors? And then what they did is they said, what happens if we just take P and we gather all the things that seem like they're written by this source, the priestly source? If we take them and put them all through, like take out everything else, take out J, E, and D, and all you have left is P. And what they found is when you do that, P is one continuous, coherent narrative. Think about that for a moment. P is just one continuous narrative where every time you have P being uninterrupted by J or E or something like that, if you take out J and E, you end up with P. Likewise with J and E, all these sources on their own, if you remove the other sources, like you take all the stories that have God referred to without the name Yahweh but using the L-type words, you take all the other stories out, you have those stories of that source, and it's one continuous narrative. So it's like, what it looks like is you have all these independent works, and then they were all stitched together to make this one big, long account, So this is how, that's the basic idea behind the documentary hypothesis. And then there's the view, basically the view is that there was a redactor or an editor that later came and compiled them. So you have different sources, and then you have a compiler who might change a word here or there or add a thing to join the stories together to make it a continuous narrative flow. So that's why we read it and it's continuous narrative, but there's things that are kind of like, well, why is that so different? And by the way, I want to clarify, for J and E, the idea isn't that the people who refer to God as El or Elohim rejected the name Yahweh. It's that they had a different view. J and E have different views as to when God started to be called Yahweh. So, for instance, in what scholars designate as the J source, do you guys remember in Genesis chapter 4 where it talks about a guy named, what's his name? Not Enoch, but it's something like Enoch, right? And it says at Enoch. And at that time, people began to call on the name Yahweh. That's what it says. Enoch, and at that time, people began to call on the name Yahweh. Well, that's in what is designated as the J source, the Yahweh source. And from that point, all the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all that, they refer to God as Yahweh. And it's Yahweh all the way through. But in the other stories, you're reading it and it's referring to God as Elohim or El and all of that, and not using Yahweh. And then you get into Exodus with that source, and it says, you have the Lord appearing to Moses and saying, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I was known to them by the name El Shaddai, and I was not known to them by the name Yahweh. But now I reveal my name Yahweh to you. So there you have one source within the Bible saying they weren't known as Yahweh until Moses, or God wasn't known as Yahweh until Moses. And then the other source says that it was from the days of Enos that people began to call him Yahweh. And then you have two sets of stories, over 30 stories that parallel one another. It's basically the same story twice. And one set has God being referred to as Yahweh all along from the days of Enos. And the other one has God being referred to as Elohim up until the time of Moses, and then it's also referred to as Yahweh. So there are many other aspects to this as to why it is thought that people used, that it was originally these separate individual sources rather than it being one work. Likewise, certain ancient writings like Jeremiah has a lot of parallel with the D material, Deuteronomy material. But it doesn't have a lot of parallel with the other sources of the Pentateuch. So how is it? Like if Jeremiah had the Pentateuch as we have it today, why is he influenced by just the D material and not the other material? And then why is it with Ezekiel? Ezekiel is influenced by the P material, but not so much by the other material. So if Ezekiel had the Pentateuch as we have it today, then why is he not influenced by all that other material, but only the quote-unquote P material, the priestly material? And in fact, one thing that I want to investigate, but I just came across this today, historians believe that there's a place in Ezekiel that actually quotes from P material. So it's like this. Like, imagine this. Imagine you have a page, and you're reading your page, and it's one material is the priestly source. And then it goes to the Yahweh source, the J source. And then it switches back to the priestly source. But if you take out the J source, the priestly source is one continuous narrative, right? So here's the thing. Apparently there's a place in Ezekiel that actually quotes P, where it goes from one place to the other, where in the Pentateuch as we have it now, there's J in between. So what that would show, if Ezekiel is quoting the priestly source without J there, it shows that he had the priestly source without that. In other words, it would show that the priestly source was originally a separate composition, a separate work that was later combined with the other sources. Again, in what I came across today in relation to that, it cited a book that gives that information, but it didn't give the information. So I'm not sure where in Ezekiel, I'm not sure which part of the Pentateuch it's quoting, or it wasn't even the Pentateuch, but what part of the priestly writing. So there's, more to be looked into to verify that. And even in me saying this, just so you all know, I'm not trying to advocate the documentary hypothesis right now. I'm not trying to say that the documentary hypothesis and the way that scholars conceive of it is actually the way it is. That's something that we need to investigate. But there are compelling reasons to believe that, for one, the Pentateuch was not written by Moses. I think that's already demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt. Second, that it was very likely written by multiple sources, that it was a composite document rather than one continuous document written by one person at one time. So if that's the case, that establishes a basis for the idea of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 being different accounts. Now, we can already see, even going through it, that they're different. Even without all that, you can see that they're different, and we are going to go through it. But I think that that information is helpful to recognize not only are they different, but the reason for the difference may simply be that they were originally totally separate works by separate authors. So we're going to go through that. I'm thinking, though, that maybe what we should do right now is take a little bit of a break. We've been on for basically 2 hours, even though we haven't been studying straight for the whole of that time. We've been studying for an hour and a half. It'd be nice to take a little break and then come back. Right now, it's just about the hour. So how about 15 after? That sounds good. Yeah, we'll come back at 15 after and continue on looking at Genesis 2 briefly, and then we will look at the other creation accounts, more or less, throughout the Hebrew Scriptures.